Hey there, this is Della Rucker. Thank you so much for joining me today. I am apologetic to start out with. I'm running a little late, and I'm running a little late because I have been working away on my most recent Wiseful Digest, which is the weekly newsletter and news digest that I put out I go for every Monday. Sometimes it has to move a little bit, but it goes out to subscribers to my Substack, and it's an email newsletter about a few articles from the past couple of weeks that were particularly interesting to me, with a little bit of expository, a little bit of explanation, a little bit of thinking about how the items in that article, or how the issues being brought up in that article, illuminate or give us some insight into how that local economy revolution that I talk about has been playing out, or is in the process of playing out, in our real world and in the world and the lives of everyone around us. So I love doing this newsletter. I think it's really interesting and really it's a good way to get into some stuff that I wouldn't have time or justification to do otherwise. And I think you might find it, if you're willing to watch these videos or you've read any of my other work. My suspicion is that you would find this very interesting. Super cheap, easy to sign up for. Just go to wiseeconomy.substack.com, and there's some other benefits in addition to the Wiseful Digest that you get if you sign up for that. So again, wiseeconomy.substack.com. You can also see some examples of the content that's in those subscriber newsletters, the Wiseful Digest. Again, wiseeconomy.substack.com. And as I usually say, one of the things that I'm most proud of is the work that I've been able to do on this book, which is The Local Economy Revolution Has Arrived: What's Changed and How You Can Help. And this is a book that's not just for people whose day jobs are to work on cities or to work on communities or to make places better for the people who live there, but it's really for all of us who take care of and work for the betterment of our communities, whether that's a neighborhood or it's a region, whether it's your day job, it's your passion, or it's something that just matters to you and you haven't quite figured out how to do it yet. I think this book can be really helpful to folks in any of those situations. And one of the reasons why I wrote it was because we have so much information out there about how different programs work and how different, so-and-so, such-and-so city is doing a particular initiative, or gee, why don't we have parklets in our city? And, how do I create a new nonprofit to get people to work? All of these kind of things. And we tend to do it in isolation. We tend to approach these issues as though it were just about kind of going and doing a thing, without really thinking through why previous efforts haven't worked and how the world has changed and is in the process of changing. So that's really what this book is about. Somebody described it as giving a roadmap to the top of the mountain across the chasm. It's not a blueprint that shows you every rock and tree and bit along the way, but it's also not just painting a vision on a hill and leaving you to figure out the details. So that's why I think it's particularly valuable, and why I think it's particularly valuable in this moment where we are in this process of transition in virtually all aspects of our lives. And one of the things that happens when you have to rethink a situation from scratch is that you have to get very clear on what are the fundamentals of what you're trying to accomplish and of what you're dealing with. Because if you don't, then you're sort of shooting in the dark. So that's a huge piece, not in terms of pages, but in terms of import, in terms of importance. That's a big piece of what this book is about. So I've been going through and reading and talking a little bit here about some of those core principles, which I took to calling the first principles of the local economy revolution. And the purpose of these is not to, to give you a 10 commandments or something like that, but it's really to give us some very clear pictures of what this new world is like and what kind of the implications are for us at a very fundamental level, so that we can keep those sort of in front of our eyes. Because one of the other things that I learned through a lot of years of trying to find new ways to solve a lot of the issues that have been either endemic to our communities or that have been growing or exacerbating or changing over certainly the period of my career, if not much earlier. And the characteristic is that even if when we have the best intentions, we fall back into old habits super, super, super easily. If you've ever tried to lose weight or quit smoking or, stop picking at your cuticles, or that's a gross one, but my son does that. So it's like, that one's always on top of mind for me. But when you're trying to change the way that you do something, you have to have both the conscious knowledge of what you're trying to go for and the systems to get you there. If you just say, oh, I don't want to smoke anymore, for a lot of people that doesn't work. Certainly for me, when I've said I want to lose weight or I want to start exercising again, just saying that isn't enough to actually make it happen. I have to keep my goals very consciously in front of me, in addition to changing my behavior. So the first principles are about having those goals in front of us. A lot of the rest of the book is about the ways that we change that behavior. So one of the first principles that I have talked about a lot, and this is one of the ones that actually was a carry through from an earlier version of a book I did. And it's surprisingly unchanged. And that book was written nearly 10 years ago, but it's more relevant today than ever. And I think when I was originally writing that back in 2013, or actually more like 2011 or 2012, talking about the idea of growing your own economy was a little pie in the sky. It was a little out there. But as we've certainly learned over the course of the last many years, and particularly coming out of the coronavirus pandemic, I think we're more aware than ever of how important our understanding and the resilience of our local economies is to having communities that can function and can thrive. So here is the first principle as it's laid out in the Local Economy Revolution has arrived. We need to cultivate our native economic species. The thing that grows naturally where you are can, with a little help and protection, provide more long-term benefit and fewer unintended repercussions than the exotics that we sometimes try to transplant at great cost. In this era, the chase after the flashy, the big, the long shot is too costly and too risky to deserve the lion's share of our attention. That means that we have to focus on our assets instead of just our deficits. We're used to seeing signs of deficits: vacant buildings, left out people, failed businesses, organizations that struggle to pay their staff, and we interpret those as meaning that something is broken, that something requires an influx of money, of experts, of programs to fill that deficit. And often, something new is definitely needed. But what if at least part of the solution comes from the very things that we assumed were the deficits? What if we really dug into and valued and built upon the left out people and those unique things that they are capable of doing? What if we used those vacant buildings to enable new ways of working and creating that build upon the intrinsic asset, the intrinsic value of those assets, not just what we think they should be? What could we create uniquely right here with this and these? It hasn't been created yet. After all, that which makes you unique makes you valuable. There is little value in being a commodity, but there's much opportunity in a well-defined niche. So there's a lot kind of in there. And, I've worked for years with the buy local movement, with buy local campaigns. I have a partnership with Amoeba, the American Independent Business Alliance. That is an organization I'd strongly recommend that you check out if you don't know them. Local, buy local, supporting local, all of that is enormously important. But it's not just important because we're going to keep our money local, or because we're not supporting the fat cats or anything like that. One of the biggest pieces of the importance of valuing the local and building and growing on the local, two particular pieces that to me are particularly powerful. One is that as we focus on building the local, we focus on creating something that is legitimately new. If you look at the history of large corporations in the US, particularly the ones that are the oldest, you will very often find that they grew initially out of something that was a unique local characteristic. The example I use a lot is Procter & Gamble, because I live in Cincinnati and I have, relationship with Procter & Gamble. My husband actually works for P&G. But when you look at P&G's story, the incredible thing about what P&G has grown into today is that it's in Cincinnati, of all the places, because of access to the raw materials of its first product, which was candles. And being in Cincinnati created an opportunity for candles and later for soap as a result of the fact that Cincinnati in the 1900s was known as Porkopolis. And what were candles and early soaps made out of? Lard, pig fat. I'm not saying that we should be, going around looking for pigs to turn into candles. That's not the point here. But P&G has stayed here and has grown here and has rooted here from that initial early access. And it has stayed here, even though P&G hasn't made candles for probably over 100 years. And certainly soap is very seldom made. I don't think. Somebody can correct me on that. But, you don't need access to pig slaughtering to make soap anymore. But the amazing, and you can find this story, you can find variants of this story in communities all over the country. The amazing thing about those kind of companies is that they have stayed and grown where they rooted. And that growth often takes them in a very, very different direction. P&G is a multinational corporation now, but its roots are still here. And its benefits, a lot of the benefits are still here. And that's a very different approach to economic development than what we've become accustomed to. And it's a very different approach to figuring out how to grow a community. And of course, nobody was trying to figure it out. They just did it, and it worked out that way. But when we look at what we have and the unique characteristics of what we have, that's when we really have the opportunity to grow something that is not just another thing, but is something that can provide a unique benefit, maybe not just to our community, but to the world. So that's an important piece of what this idea of growing your native fauna or your native species is about. And species in kind of the metaphorical sense, talking about our local economies and what is it that we uniquely have access to here. The other thing, though, that I think is so important in talking about that issue and talking about that mindset and talking about that change of perspective is that if we are really valuing what we've got locally and we see that as assets, instead of seeing those as limitations, then we don't have to rely so much on recruiting in from out in the rest of the world. We have less of that insecurity, that lack of value for ourselves as communities. And, for someone who grew up in the Rust Belt, and the very term Rust Belt implies, a place that isn't valued, a place that isn't wanted, a place that isn't where you can grow a future. We really imbibed, that message. And I think we really missed some key opportunities. And we're dealing with the repercussions of having missed those now. So the definition of success for a community fundamentally is about how well it takes care of its people, how healthy and resilient the community can be when downturns happen, when challenges hit, which is a big issue that's showing up in that Wise Fool Digest on Substack that I mentioned a few minutes ago. So it's ironic that wasn't intended to fit together, and it always ends up fitting together some way or another. It's kind of, how the heck's that happen? All right. But the ability to kind of to grow from what we have, it also changes who we are as a community and who we are as individuals. So one of the articles that I'm writing about in the Wise Fool Digest talks about how changing an individual or a population's ability to have agency, and they actually use the word agency, which I always thought was just a wonk word that I used, and then it was always like, well, which agency is that? The Department of Human Services, or got very confusing. But when people had the ability to say, hey, I can make choices for myself, that then had repercussions for that person and also for their families and for the community in which they live. And having agency, having the ability to say, I am not a victim, I can go and make, that's a core characteristic. It's certainly one, when we look at immigration, to the US, particularly in the 19th centuries. The people who tended to be able to immigrate tended to be people who had already had enough good fortune to be able to have some sense of that agency. They were not the completely impoverished. Over and over again, doesn't matter which population you're looking at, the people who immigrated were not the poorest and not the wealthiest, but they were the folks who had enough resources to work with that they could say, I can go and I can make something happen for myself and for the people around me. And so when we invest in local resources, when we invest in growing that local economy versus trying to grab it and recruit it in from somewhere else, I think we're also growing that agency. We're also, and it's not going to happen overnight, this takes time, but we're also creating additional possibilities. And it's cumulative, right? It's like a muscle that you have to learn to use that you haven't used before. But as you learn to use it, new opportunities open up. You can stretch and bend and move in ways that maybe you didn't have the ability to do before. So when we talk about that local species, yes, we're talking about locally owned businesses, and we're talking about buy local, and we're talking about that ability to keep money and keep resources within a community. But we're also talking about something much bigger, which is about creating communities that are really able to live up to their potential. So that's big stuff, and that's kind of heady compared to what we're used to talking about when it comes to economic development and economic development incentives and all of this kind of thing. But it's really where the crux of it is. One of the biggest differences between the industrial era that we have all been sort of brought up in and are now finding ourselves having to come out of, and this new world that I often call the fusion economy, is that the power of human creativity, human insight, and that's really where the growth potential is. It's not in recruiting something. And that's part of why I think we're seeing so much challenge in communities that are trying to recruit high tech or high knowledge base businesses, and then struggling to fill those roles because that hasn't been a priority for that community before. So for me, cultivating local species is about really recultivating the potential for our communities to be resilient and for the places that we care about to be able to really live into their potential. That's language that, to me, as sort of a heavily, whichever brain side it is, a heavily, left brain person, so logical. Yeah, we're going to go with that one. So that's language that isn't always comfortable for me. And it probably isn't all that comfortable for many of you as well, because it sounds flaky and fluffy and, kind of like not serious. But fundamentally, that's where we are right now. And when we resist the idea that creating new human potential is a part of our jobs, then we're falling back into that industrial era mindset. So thinking about the opportunity and the benefits of growing our native species, that's an important piece of learning to retrain our own brains to not fall back into that, that's like, new agey talk, but really see that is a practical characteristic of the world that we're moving into. So that's just a few thoughts on one of the first principles of the local economy revolution has arrived. And I want to thank you for taking the time to listen today. I'm still in the process of learning how to do video. And as I joked a week or two ago, when you're 52 and you've been a writer all your life, just like it was hard for me to re-find my personal writing voice after 20 years of writing, reports and National Register nominations and plans and what all. Just like it was hard to find my personal voice there's a challenge here ongoing as well. So I'm grateful for your feedback. Just like when I was first starting to write 10 years ago, people's feedback made an enormous difference to my ability to communicate clearly and effectively. Your feedback today has the same impact. So you can reach out to me anytime. Della Rucker is pretty easy to find on, pick your platform, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, whatever. And definitely make sure to check out both the Local Economy Revolution has arrived, which is available on Gumroad, on Lulu.com, and also on Amazon. And if you want to be part of kind of a deeper conversation and a more current events oriented conversation, join me on Substack at wiseeconomy.substack.com. And stay tuned for some new things that are in the pipeline, not quite ready to announce yet, but hopefully soon. So thanks again. And one of the great challenges here is for us to be brave and determined enough to do the difficult things. And so go get them. Thanks.